Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first 2024 episode of Kanban for Everyone. I'm Colleen Johnson. I'm the CEO of ProKanban.org. I'm super excited to welcome Johanna Rothman to our panel today. And Johanna, I was commenting in LinkedIn. I think I saw you speak for the very first time at a software testing conference. I know it was the late 90s, I think, because I remember I wasn't old enough to rent my own car. I had to tag along with everyone else because I couldn't get my own rental car because I wasn't 25 yet. But you've been in this space for a very long time. You're known as the pragmatic manager. And we were talking before we came live here that I think you've got almost 24, you heard that right, almost 24 books on leadership and product development and product delivery. So welcome. Thank you for being here. What did I miss? Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much. And I was realizing I really need to get a new professional picture. My hair has gotten much grayer since the last time I had a picture taken. So I think you got it mostly. I think you got enough of it that I don't need to say anymore. I write a lot because I write because I understand what I actually know and what I don't know. So I actually write for me. And when I figure out enough about a topic, that's when I don't just collect it into a book. Very few books of collections actually work that well. But I then say, what does the reader need to know? You will recognize this as a user journey, right? The user journey for the reader, and then I can write the book.
Yeah. And I had the pleasure of sitting through your writing class recently. So we'll have to put that in the show notes if anybody's interested in taking Johanna's writing class. I highly, highly recommend it. Oh, yeah. Somebody else said their first time hearing you was also at the software testing conferences.
Oh, that's hysterical.
Your audience here goes way back.
Oh, nice.
Let's talk a little bit about your books to start. So your books are really anchored in this concept of delivery and leadership and delivering products. So what first brought you into that realm?
So my very first job out of school was on a phone system for the Department of Defense. And we had it was all in phases. It was a serial life cycle. And but we actually worked as collaborators, not as a collaborative team. And I had to ask all of my peers for comments on my design, and then for comments on my code. And then I was able to implement it. This is back when we had key punch ladies, right? A long, long time ago. I really disliked those old days. Everything took way too long. And I had I was supposed to implement conference calling. Now think of this, 1977, right? We did not have conference calling on our regular phones. But I had to implement conference calling on this particular phone system. I had just finished it. I had not tested it. My boss came to me and said, the general is here. You need to show it for the general. I said, I haven't tested it. I don't know if it works. He said, how bad could it be? Remember those words? I had implemented it backwards. There was one bit in the database that said who could talk and who could listen. I implemented it so the general could only listen. Everyone else could talk. Now, you might actually say that was the right way to do it, but that was not the intent. So that's when I realized all of the feedback loops, all the feedback I had been getting, all of my interim deliveries were useful, but not good enough. And so that that's when I started to say, how can I deliver something faster that's more useful? That I wouldn't say that's been my life's mantra, but it's been kind of close.
Yeah. Well, and so your newest book that just came out is Project Life Cycles. And we'll dig into a little bit more of the content in that book here shortly. But our topic for today is about flow metrics. And so I think I would love to start off with what brought you to flow metrics. I think you've had those concepts through some of your previous books as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
But this newest one is really where you anchor those 4 measures around how to do 2 things. You talk about feature delivery and you talk about decision making. So let's start with feature delivery, right? What brought you to flow metrics for feature delivery?
So once I realized I could measure cycle time and not anything with relative estimation and not anything with all the, especially not breaking down requirements into tasks. I had learned many years ago that the more you break down a requirement into tasks and you add up all of the estimations, the larger your padding is, right? So
Yeah.
that was not very useful. So I actually stopped estimating many years ago. And what I did do way back in the 90s was I had yellow stickies on a whiteboard. And I said to people, what do you think you can deliver this month? Just show me what you're going to deliver. Put it about where, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, approximately where you think it's going to be. Then you generate all the inch pebbles you need for that work, right? Inch pebbles are 1 to 2 day tasks that are either done or not done. I was not smart enough to make them stories at the time, but in all the organizations I worked with, people tended to work in collaborative cross-functional teams, what we might call an agile team now. They weren't full agile teams. They were mostly developers. The testers were still at the end, right? It was not perfect, but it was pretty good. And when the developers put out their yellow stickies, the testers would go in and say, hey, wait a minute. If you do this now, I can't get to it until later. So that we had all the negotiation. Now we were only planning for 4 weeks at a time. So this worked really well. That was way back in the 90s. I wrote about that in Manage It, Your Guide to Modern Pragmatic Project Management. And that was a form of cycle time. I did not recognize it then. And I also insisted that nobody on my projects could multitask. That multitasking was a disaster. It was not going to happen. I would show management the chart of when people were assigned to my project full time, and if they were not assigned full time, I took no responsibility for any delivery. I went on and on and on. So I I did not realize I was using lean concepts. I didn't have a name for it.
Yeah. And you talk in the new book too about the trap that we often get into when we're looking at resource efficiency versus focusing on the flow of work. And so was there a light bulb moment or any of those examples where you were running those projects where you said trying to manage the people is not working when we're focusing on delivering the value? Because I think a lot of organizations still operate from that lens of we have to keep all the developers busy. They're expensive. I want to make sure they're 100% utilized, even if that means nothing's shipping out the other end.
So that's when I realized I started understanding that when I wrote the first version of the project portfolio book and said, stop multitasking people because that takes way too long. But I realized when I was writing this book that the more, and well, let me pop back up the stack for a second. Cost accounting reinforces resource efficiency.
Yeah.
Now, I think that the big thing managers are missing is the fact that we can manage with lean measures, right? We don't need to use, in fact, if we manage with the 4 flow metrics, we are we are in much better shape. But we still have to report cost accounting metrics. So that's where, how do we do this as an organization? I don't think that there's an easy answer, but just because we have to report in cost accounting does not mean we have to manage with cost accounting, because cost accounting doesn't work, and it's anti-agility, right? I don't care if you use any form of an agile approach. Some products really are not really meant for a true agile approach. But the more often we deliver and get feedback, even just internally, the more likely we have the right product. So that's why I have such a focus on how do we use cycle time and flow metrics, and watching the flow of work through the system, so we can actually figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the other half of what you talked about, right? So leveraging phone metrics for feature delivery, the other half of this was for decision making. And one of my favorite things that you talked about in the book was that our decision cadence is dependent on our feedback cadence. Can you talk more about that?
So the longer it takes for the team to deliver, the longer the management needs to assess that delivery and then make a new decision. Now, it might be for the product strategy, and it might be for the project portfolio, right? So, um, but the longer everything takes, the longer everything takes.
Yeah.
Right. And if you start, I think of it as an onion where you start with the team, and the faster the team can make their deliverables. And I'm talking about finished work, not slapdash, not not icky stuff, not I'm trying not to use the word crap. Um, but useful stuff to somebody, right? Then we understand the risk, or we understand what we learned, or the customer can use it. Any of those things. The faster the team can make that onion, can make their cadence, the faster the product managers, product owners, product leaders can reassess the product strategy. And then the managers can reassess the project portfolio.
Yeah, and I think, when a lot of times when we talk about feedback and quick feedback loops, I think we tend to focus just on product feedback. Like, what are we learning? What can we fold in? But I love the way you really focus this on the leadership lens too, of if leaders are getting that feedback, it's helping them make decisions about what to prioritize, what to work on next. It's not just a product lens at that point. And so I'm seeing some great questions in here from a leadership perspective too. Somebody asked, what would you say to leaders who want to convert story points to hours? And maybe we could even expand on that a little bit of what are the first steps you take to try to introduce flow measures to leaders and managers and move them away from cost accounting, like you mentioned.
Well, I think that people still want to know, when will it be done, right? So they want the hours for a very good reason. So instead of saying, well, you should take what we have for these story points, I then try and say to the teams, how can you right size the stories so that you can do one a day and only have to count them? Because counting is easy, right? And you might be wrong. Um, Sometimes my blog posts take a lot more than the hour or two I allocated for them. That's fine. But how do I generate something useful almost every single day? And if the teams start to think like that, then the teams can say to the managers, we won't give you story points anymore. We're not going to use story points, but almost assume that almost everything takes about a day of the team's time. Not a day of Colleen's time, and then a day of Johanna's time, and then a day of Tim's time. No, we are all going to work together. All of us together will finish something about once a day. Sometimes it might take us 2 days, right? But most of the time, we have right sized our stories so that we can generate one thing every day. Now, all anybody has to do is count. You want something that's 50 stories a day away? It's 50 days. I mean, I,
Yeah.
I, the most managers do not have the time They are focused on these very, very big decisions. They don't have the intellectual bandwidth to do any kind of magical thinking. And story points require magical thinking, which
That would
means,
be my favorite quote from today, by the way.
yeah, okay. And so if you don't ask managers to do magical thinking, if you say to them, we need to do these 3 or 4 or 5 things in advance of anything else, but that means next week we could do something that you want, that you're asking for in 3 months. Now,
Yeah.
if you don't need it for 3 months away, why would you ask us about it?
Right. Right. And it's like the decision fatigue, right? Of trying to think about all of those things instead of focusing on that smaller piece of work and focusing on the delivery side instead of all of that, thinking of cost accounting. Think about the cost of spending all that time trying to estimate work that you might not get to for 3 months. I think
Yeah,
we forget about how expensive that part of that process is. Whether you're doing story points or not, even just trying to
right.
estimate in hours is expensive. Um, well, so you also talk in the book about um, the concept of risk, and I was excited to see this in the new book too, because when we talk about forecasting and a lot of the pro Kanban content, we talk about this concept of managing risk. And even if you can't get a lot of buy-in on process or a buy-in on flow metrics, I think leadership always understands this concept of managing and mitigating risk. So you introduce 3 types of risk. Can you tell us what those are?
So there's the project risks, which is about how the team can do all their work. And then the product risks, which is all about how do we make our trade-offs for innovation, right? If we don't need very much innovation, we don't really need an agile approach, right? And an agile approach requires cultural change. So I've been saying to people, if you don't need an agile approach, don't do it, right?
Yeah.
Use an incremental life cycle. It will work very well for you. And then there's all the portfolio risks, the senior lead, maybe mid to senior level management risks. How do we balance what we release when, so we can attract customers who will pay us for our products? So if you read any of my previous project management books, I talk about the project pyramid with you can only have, it's a 6-sided pyramid, and you can only have one thing is number one. So if you want to optimize for features, you can, but you will always have the other 5 sides: the cost, the date, the people, the environment, all that stuff as secondary. Only one number one, only one number two, only one number three, right? And that's I've written about that before. And then the innovation risks, I think, are what really um, I saw this in so many of my clients, where we really need to think about what kind of innovation do we need. And a particular client brought it home on the last couple of years. The team really wanted to use an agile approach, because even though they were just doing a port, they found all kinds of problems in the older system, all kinds of issues with bugs that had stayed under the radar for so long. And once they fixed those problems, all these other problems piled up. So while management thought this is a no innovation product, the team actually discovered it was a very innovation heavy product. So that mismatch of expectations really made a mismatch of how they should organize the project. And then all the portfolio risks, where the managers need to design and update their decisions on a faster basis.
Yeah. In your experience, is there ever a time where fast feedback isn't valuable or short feedback loops would not be valuable?
I have not encountered that yet. I mean, I I keep trying to shorten my feedback loops in everything I do, because even if it's just me learning, the speed of my learning is what allows me to deliver my products. And it's exactly the same in the teams I coach and work with.
Yeah, I just had this conversation with my oldest kiddo yesterday because he was all mad that something he had turned in hadn't been graded yet, but the teacher gave it back to him with feedback with no grade. And I was like, well, isn't that better? Wouldn't you want that first before you just find out if you got a bad grade on it? That gives you that feedback quicker. So it's I mean, it applies to everything.
Yeah.
So in those three types of risk, project, product, portfolio, how do you see flow metrics applied to helping that conversation about the risk at each level?
So I really like to start with the top, with the portfolio, because if management needs more speed of decision making, right, that will drive all the other issues in the organization. And I realize that sounds funny. We are so accustomed to thinking about flow metrics for the teams, but it turns out that the more we think about flow metrics for managers, the more likely we are to have a better outcome in the organization.
I totally agree with you. I think we do focus a lot of it on the team, maybe even almost too much on the delivery side sometimes of focusing on what like you said, when will it be done is the $1 million question. When you think about ways that managers can start to get better at getting this data and using it every day, especially if you're working with more than one team or more than one project, where would you recommend they start?
So I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to find my. I have a. Here's my. I have a blog post about that. I'm going to put that in. Can I put that? I don't. How do I add a comment?
If you hit join the chat at the bottom of the comments tab.
Okay.
So somebody in the comments just said scrap Jira. If not, you can also drop it in the private chat and I can take it.
All right. I'm going to drop in the private chat because it wants me to connect my YouTube channel and I haven't done that yet. So
we'll get it added for you.
Thank you. So this is not the actual data from a real story, right? A real client, as a new senior leader came into the organization and had all these teams doing all this work. Everyone was ridiculously busy, and the throughput of the organization was so slow. So this manager, the senior leader, was brought in to fix the teams. The teams didn't really need fixing. So you got that, right?
Yep, we just
here we are. Okay, good. So there's a table in there that actually has fake data, but the same idea as what the senior manager encountered. And this is how long the projects had been going. And what was interesting is how many other projects that team finished while they were waiting for this first project to finish, right? So all the multitasking, all the lack of throughput really made everyone in this organization kind of nuts. And when I realized that, and this was a direct indication of the flow metrics, that's when I said, that we really need to think about this for the managers. That if we ask people, if we overload people, so they're either multitasking or they have no time to think, their throughput will be much, much lower. Their cycle time will be much higher, right? All of this is, it's just, this is how it works. So when I realized that, I had not actually made, of course, until I wrote this down, until I talked to this person, I said, oh, you need to know about flow metrics. Yeah. So That's when I first started realizing that it was more important for managers, because the managers will then say, oh, you don't have to work on all this other stuff. Now focus on this one project. Now that allows the product leaders to say, what's the next one or two or three things we need the team to do? And now, team, how fast can you deliver that first one, and then the second one, and then the third? Right? So it's when we change how managers think and their actions, that allows the rest of the organization to change.
And so, you talk about this concept of how much work is in progress. If there's anyone in the audience who's not familiar with the 4 flow metrics, we're talking, what Johanna's talking about is WIP. So actual work in progress, not the sum of your WIP limits, but how much are we actually working on at one time? I see a lot of folks go, oh, I'll total up the WIP limits, even though we may be under or over those on any given day. And when we talk about the relationship between cycle time and throughput, like you're describing, we're talking about the actual number of projects or initiatives that we might have in progress across the whole organization. And so I want to ask you the question, do you think single piece flow for organizations at a feature level or project level, is that realistic?
I think that single project flow for a given team is realistic. And then depending on the size of the teams, that's what really matters for single piece flow. So I don't do single piece flow.
I don't
mean,
either.
I can't. I have books in progress, and I am not really ashamed to say I have several books in progress, because I only work on one of them at a time, but it's partly, what do I need to learn to do the next bit of work on this book, right? Because if I need to learn something, I'm not going to stop writing to learn. I'm going to keep writing in some way, shape, or form. But I might change what I write to learn something new. And I think that a lot of people think that single piece flow means we cannot work on anything else. But if you have a large enough team, say instead of this 5 to 7 person nonsense, what if you had 9 or 10 people on a team, and you had enough people to do 5 on 2 different features and really finish it, really collaborate to finish? Well, now maybe 2 features is the right number. But what I don't recommend is where developers work on one thing and testers work on another,
Yeah.
because we're going to have feedback loops there, and that will slow us down. So even if you can only do 3 people at a time or 4 people, right? A UI person, as many other developers as you need, and a tester, and use that as a sub team. Maybe that's your I often recommend single piece for those 3 or 4 people, but not necessarily for the entire team.
And Pratik will be so happy that you brought up the team size thing, because I think we see that trap too a lot of times. Not so much that the team's so big that it needs maybe more work or 2 features for a big team, but that the teams are so small that we create these, almost like we create our own dependencies that then create this lag in our feedback loops, because we're trying to stay within a certain team size. I think you've done some writing around this recently as well. We'll have to post that in the links here, but some of the rules we've created make some of those things more challenging for ourselves. And I would argue even the construct of a sprint, I think, does this too, where you were just saying like things get offset, where we have, even though we don't want them to be, we may have developers working on one sprint goal, and testers are still working on the sprint goal from the sprint before. So another example, I think, of where that gets offset based off maybe constructs that we don't need.
Yeah.
Lack of focus. Well, I want to start to invite some folks. I know we have a great audience here of people listening in live. Feel free to start posting your comments or questions into the chat, and we'll start asking Johanna some of the questions from the audience. One of the other things you talked about in the book, and that really resonated with me. I mentioned that I started off. Well, I saw you at a testing conference. I started my career in software testing, but you in the book you describe waterfall as serial delivery, which I think creates such a concrete picture of everything that creates, right? All of everything
Right.
gets completed before the next phase gets completed. And you talked about how unplanned feedback and serial delivery, and it's what you were just saying from a testing perspective too. So can you walk us through a little bit of that anti-pattern of unplanned feedback?
So let's admit, I will just use an example of this book, right? The Project Life Cycles book. Because it's a product, I always have a user journey for the book. Always. And I realized about halfway through the book, and the book is short, so it was relatively easy to create a user journey. But let me go to the table of contents. I got to chapter I got to through all the life cycles, and I was ready to go to to the agile approach chapter. And then I realized the agile approach chapter was way too big, right? I mean, I could have written it like that, but it was not going to serve my reader, right? So I separated it, and I added challenges back in all the other chapters. Now, because this book is relatively short, I did not have to worry about what my readers would have thought about it and disappointing them. So it was relatively easy for me to go back and fix it, right? Because a book is a little bit different from a software product. But I found that particular example so illuminating. I had, I had created a user journey for this book. And as I wrote it, I realized the user journey was not exactly right. I needed to thread some other pieces of the product back in previous chapters. We do this all the time. It's even worse in a serial life cycle because that's when we have planned our architecture. We have planned our design. We have planned everything. And we don't know until we start to test that all of our plans were well meaning, but not sufficient. And I don't know about you. When I drive somewhere, well, it's Boston. You're in Denver. You have much better highways. But when I'm in Boston, I find that I always use a map, a GPS traffic aware app. Always. Because the traffic is going to change any second. Why would I not do that with my product development? Right?
Yeah.
Why would our teams not do that with our product development? Because the later we have the feedback loop, the more opportunity for that project kiss of death, where we say, this is not even worth doing anymore because we have so much work to redo. It's just, we're not going to be able to get this product out when we want it out. And I want to avoid the project kiss of death all the time.
Well, and I think, even inside of organizations using agile practices, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, you can still trap yourself in that cycle of not having feedback. And you described this in the book, and I was like, I see this so often, and it drives me nuts. Where you go in somewhere, and it's like, well, here's the next 6 months and what we're doing in every single sprint. It's like, oh, okay. Well, where at what there's no space, there's no opportunity to reroute, right? Or take a different path depending on that feedback. And then I think it also creates this long-term commitment inside the organization that no one's comfortable pausing or deviating from that plan, because it's like, well, it's published and here's what we'll have in 6 months and here's what we have to do every sprint, even though we're probably going to be off the very first sprint we try to deliver on. So that loop too, I think it ties well to your traffic analogy, because it's not giving you a chance to get that feedback and take a different path.
And the more a team will deliver demos at the very least, the more often they demo, the more people say, "Oh, our roadmap, our long backlog is not matching our demo. Maybe
Yeah.
we should do something about this. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing a couple of great questions come in here. Enrique said the real chutzpah becomes what single work really needs to be done, determined by what is limiting financial throughput. How do you determine the work to be done constraints?
So when I think about the single most important piece of work, I often look to a product leader, and well, I if we're talking about the team, let's take the team first. The product leader almost always knows what is the most important thing we need to do right now to satisfy our major customer, our most important customer, our the people who will pay us more. And if you ask the product leader, if you only could choose one thing, what is that one thing? They will often tell you. They often know. They feel a whole lot of pressure from the rest of the organization to say, oh, one, two, and three, and four. But they often know for their product what is that one thing. And if I go to senior management and say, you only get one thing per team. What do you want that one team to do? And they all say, oh, we need it all. We need it all now. I said, no, no more magical thinking, right? We have too much magical thinking in many dimensions. I said, you know that if you I I often use the example of my younger daughter when she was 10. I asked her to set the table, finish making the salad dressing, and get pour all the waters for everybody. And she said, "Mom, I'm one person. What one thing do you want me to do right now?" And I said, "Oh, right. I I am asking my daughter to do something I would not ask my clients to do. In fact, I tell them, no, don't do this." So that's when I said I often use that as a story because almost everybody can relate to that, whether or not you have a kid or you were a kid. And then I say, if you can only get one thing, what is that one thing? And now we have a conversation about how big that one thing is. Does it require two or more teams? I mean, we can actually talk about what the value of that is to the organization and what it would take to deliver that value. So many people talk about the cost of things and not the value.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like I do that to my kids though too. I'm not very good at limiting. I did the if anybody's ever done the game where you have a bunch of executives or senior leadership use like poker chips or fake money to pick a feature, and you give them a very limited amount of what to spend, right? I did this once with poker chips, and I feel like everybody's heads were exploding of like, well, I need a chip for everything, or can I, like, I don't understand. They're all important, and it's like they can all be important, but we can get one thing done. So what's the most important thing to get done first? It's a hard concept. It seems very simple to say. It's a hard concept, I think, to get buy-in and implement.
Yeah, I recommended we do this with business value points, which is the same idea as the poker chip, and that's in the project portfolio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a good question here from Mason. One tool I have never seen used yet in a Scrum sprint is the PO deciding the new customer priorities are so big that they need to cancel the sprint. How does Kanban handle emergencies and immediate new priorities?
So I'm not sure I even understand this question. We might have to do a little clarification. If if the priorities are so big they don't fit in a sprint, what's the first one? Right? I mean, they can't all be that big. And if that if the if the if the story epic or theme or whatever it is you want to call it is too big for a sprint, what is the first thing of value that the product owner wants? It's always the first thing of value, and it cannot be everything, and it's almost never a database.
All of it. I want the whole database.
Yeah.
And I would add, from to the second part of your question there around how does Kanban handle it, I think is a lot of what you've been talking about here. It's getting every piece of work to be as small as possible, every piece of value to be as small as possible, so that you can pull that new work in as quickly as possible. So by limiting the amount of work in progress, like Johanna's talking about, and making each of our batches, whether it's story level or feature level or epic level, as small as possible, it's going to give you a more frequent opportunity to reprioritize the work. So going back to that idea of decision cadence and feedback cadence, if you're delivering quickly because your WIP is low, you're going to have an opportunity to use that information to help you reprioritize more often.
Colleen, have you folks written on ProKanban about right-sizing work?
We have, I think there's a blog post, and I can pull that up and put that in the comments too. I think Pratik probably wrote that one. I know we've talked about it at a couple different levels too. Do you want to talk a little bit about right sizing? Or do you want me to
Yeah, and I will look for my right-sizing post, because I think too many people don't right-size, and they need to.
Yeah, and it's such a, somebody had posted a comment in the ProKanban Slack recently about how simple it was, like how much time it saved for the team, how much we were talking about mental energy earlier, just to be able to go right before we pull it in, is this small enough to be done within our service level expectation and based on past data, so that we can pull it in and get it done quickly, based on how our team delivers, how our workflow is set up. One flow metric that hasn't come up for us yet is this concept of work item age. So where do you see work item age fitting in for leaders and managers?
So I often find that, well, okay, let me tell a little story. I was working with a bunch of senior managers late last year, and they had their tool for everything. I will not name the tool, but I'm sure all of you can guess the tool. Had 5 years of defects. 5 years, right? I mean, 5 years.
And is that number going down or going up?
Oh, always going up.
Yeah.
It did not matter how fast anybody could fix anything. There were always more defects because they were always in such a rush to finish, they didn't really finish. The projected backlog was almost as long. I mean, how can you have a 5-year backlog? I don't know what I'm going to do next year. How can any organization have that? So the weight of all this stuff was just overwhelming. So I said, okay, on a decide on a day, throw everything out. Just throw it all out. You don't need 5 years of defects. You don't need 5 years of backlog or future stuff. You don't need any of that. All you need is what do we want each team to do now? One thing, maybe two. And what is our strategy for now? And then what products or services do we want to offer to implement that strategy? You don't need any more than that. You should have seen the looks on their faces. If they could have, we were remote, so they were not throwing their water or coffee at me, but they would have. They said, how can we get rid of all that data? I said, very easy. Delete. If you really can't delete it, then archive it and make it searchable if you really, really need it. But when was the last time anybody looked in that huge backlog of defects? Nobody needed to look there. It was all there. And because nobody was finishing anything all the way to finishing, you were only growing that backlog. Instead, finish something. Finish it, finish it, finish it. And then take the next thing. I mean, do the customers care about something from 5 years ago for a product you no longer support? No. Well, what if we just filter on that product? No, throw it out. The good things all come around again.
I love that, because I think we have a tendency to talk about work item age, specifically about the work that's in progress, right? And looking at how long have we been working at it and what's the oldest item. in our system or in our workflow right now so that we can organize around moving the oldest things to done sooner. We don't talk enough about how important it is to look at work item age in the backlog. And, I think that's a great way to think about, like, at what point is that adding decision complexity, right? Because there's all this stuff to comb through. I agree. Like, if it's going to come back up, somebody will re-report it if it's an important enough priority for us to pull back in or put at the top of the backlog. So I think Daniel's question here is probably similar to what we're talking about. He said, I notice in my org, we get shiny object syndrome. We do a regular intake cadence, and every time product brings us a long list of things they want when we haven't addressed half of the things they brought to us last time. Yep. Sounds like a good opportunity for work item age. How important is it that we continue to discuss things brought to us in the past? And then he said, to me, it seems like if we aren't thinking about it now, it must not be that important. So how do we reduce the noise of the unnecessary requests?
I am still working that through with some of my clients, but I think there's something about how can you, as a product leader, articulate the value of this right now to our customers or to us inside the organization as an experiment. But I really focus on value and how little can we do for the value that we get. Uh, it's going to sound like I'm being nasty to Scrum, and I'm not. But almost any iteration-based approach always focuses on how much we can push into our planning. I find push planning to be antithetical to an agile approach, right? I do this myself, and I don't want to. So instead of pushing what I'm going to do into a given week or month, I say, what is my one goal? And then I might have a plan for a week, only because I have to move from one thing to another, and then an emergency comes up, and all this stuff. So I need to be able to respond to things quickly. So I might say, in a given week, I have 5 things I want to accomplish, and that's it. I leave a lot of space in my schedule for work that emerges. And I find that a lot of teams and managers need to do this too. And I always decide on the value. What is the value of this work to me? And how little can I plan for and still achieve that value?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's another question here that I think ties to this perfectly. So somebody asked, traditional project management has the concept of EVM, earned value management, this which seems to be rarely used now, especially with agile projects. From your experience, why? Maybe that is because there's a better substitution for that metric, or is it just too old school to be used nowadays?
So earned value never made any sense for software products, right? It's not like a table. Right? With a table, you can say, if I get the legs and if I get the top, even if I don't put this on this particular table that way, I can still use the value I created earlier in something else. Software does not work that way. So earned value never made any sense at all for software products. Never. And I think that that goes back to cost accounting, where we have value in intermediate steps. We have in software products, and even in hardware, we have very, very little value in intermediate steps. We just don't have it. So thankfully, earned value is going by the wayside.
Well, and then somebody else asked, which is a great piggyback as well. Eric said, how do we track business value then on an agile project? I'm sure we have probably similar opinions here.
Finish features.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
That's the only measure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all hypothetical until it's delivered, right? It's a guess.
Right.
It's a guess of what is it valuable. And I think that's where thinking about batch size becomes so important here. That I know Pratik references the book Thinking in Small Bets by Annie Duke quite a bit when we're thinking about this. But if we can assume it's valuable. We can prioritize it as valuable based on things that we're thinking about as an organization and how it aligns to our strategy, but we don't know, unfortunately, until it's delivered typically. So how do we make sure that we're getting things out quickly? Again, feedback loops and decision making, right? So that we can get the feedback to decide whether or not we want to keep investing or do something different. All right. Any final questions for Johanna? This hour flew by. I knew it would. I always love talking with you. And as we're waiting to see if there's any follow-up questions here or questions to close us out, tell folks where they can find you and find your work.
So everything is on jrothman.com, JROTHMAN.com. And that's because I got a domain name very early when my first initial and my last name was fine. And all my books are there, my blogs are there, my workshops, all that good stuff. It's all there. I saw one more question about OKRs, and I have stopped recommending OKRs to my clients because they were not corporate-wide objectives. They cascaded down, and the key results were not corporate-wide results. So I stopped doing that. And I always say to my clients, optimize up for the organization. If you're a team member, optimize up for the team's delivery of value. If you're a product leader, optimize up for the product. If you're a middle manager or senior manager, optimize up for acquiring a new customer, retaining a customer, getting more revenue, right? Always optimize up. And that way, we don't have to bother with OKRs.
Yeah. Well, and I think so often the OKRs don't align to the work, right? So we prioritize all this work, and then we have OKRs that create more work that don't align to the things that are in our backlog or in our queues that we're pulling from. And I think that's the other, when we're thinking about focus and flow, we tend to end up with two separate sets of priorities now. What's the feature delivery we're focused on? And then what are our OKR efforts? And I think Kanban can help a little bit with aligning those things, or at least creating visibility into the fact that they're not lining up. It's not going to fix it for you. It's just going to highlight the problem, like a lot of things in Kanban, but that can help, I think, kick it off. Well, before we close out here, Johanna, what is your number one recommendation for folks, whether you're a leader or a team member, on how to start folding flow metrics into what you do every day?
So really think about how much whip do you have in, especially if you're a leader of some sort. Are you supposed to do all that whip? Is that your job? Or should you do it with a team? Often with a team. How old is your oldest decision? And can you either say, I declare this done, I declare victory, and we don't need to do anymore? And for throughput and cycle time, examine your cycle time. And if you're a leader, especially of your decision making, the longer it takes you to make a decision, the longer the teams have to wait to figure out what is really going on. And that allows you to have better throughput. Can we put this, I'm going to put this in the private chat so somebody can figure out how to put this in the regular chat. I have a little graphic in this particular newsletter, which is why we're talking, and that's all how all the flow metrics intersect. And I find that you can intervene anywhere and make it better, right? Do one thing, make it better. There's a Beatles song like that, right? And then we're in much better shape.
Yeah. And I love that. How old is your oldest decision is also kind of terrifying, right? You can think about that in so many different ways. But if we're still building off of old decisions, I think that's an interesting way to think about risk, right? We're building things based off decisions we made 6 months ago, whether that's about priority or value or cost and effectiveness. And that's unfortunately how a lot of organizations are still operating. And I think in our current economic climate, when a lot of companies are cutting costs and cutting people out of their delivery systems, this becomes even more important, right? You have to be able to make game time decisions about what's the highest priority if you've got half your workforce available to deliver it. So I love that thinking, and I think it's a really concrete way to talk to leaders about risk without getting into, this isn't about Kanban. It's not about even the process that you're using to deliver. It's really about risk management and using that data to help you make better decisions sooner.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Johanna, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll post this to YouTube as well. So if anybody joined us and would like to share the link to this with their leaders, or access any of the comments that had links to Johanna's writing, we'll make sure all of that's also available in YouTube. It was a pleasure having you, and we look forward to our next Kanban for Everyone in March.
Thank you. I look forward to it too.
Thanks so much.